audio by Raising Free People Network.
I'm Akila S. Richards, grief literacy educator, longtime podcaster, here to explore what we lose individually and collectively when we fail to name grief as part of our everyday life. Grief isn't just about death, it's about endings, expired relationships, outgrown roles, identities and dreams we released. If we tend to grief in its diversity, we can expand our capacity to navigate change, to hold space for each other, and to move with more presence in a rapidly shifting world. This is What I Let Die podcast, where we move from grief struck to grief tending. What happens when we stop avoiding grief? Let's find out together. Hey, you. Welcome back to What I Let Die, the Grief Literacy Public Service Podcast. I'm Akila S. Richards, and I'm taking lots of deep breaths because today we are closing out our third arc in this 4-part series. So today, this last episode is part of the Grief in Community arc. And we are ending it with a big, wide topic. Grieving while parenting and parenting while grieving. Because these things happen at the same time. And I think oftentimes we're either trying to hide it from our children or we're carrying the impact of our grief that our caregivers never talked about, maybe never even acknowledged. Either way, grief is in the building, shaping the dynamic, shaping our parenting, shaping the inner child and the actual child. So I figure we need to talk about it. We couldn't do a series on tending to the diversity of grief without zooming in on grieving while parenting. So let's talk about it. Parenting while grieving is often invisible, right? It's like we're showing up to the daily things, making meals, dropping people off, picking people up, doing bath time, check-ins, cleanups, all the things depending on the age and stage of your child. You are doing multiple things with pain just under the surface sometimes. Maybe it's new grief, like, something that just came up, a recent friendship breakup or dating drama that's really got you in a funk, or the death of someone, or the death or ending of something, right? So maybe the grief is new, or maybe it's old grief that's just now rising up because of something your child said or did. Maybe it's that moment when they ask you about someone who died or somebody who's not around anymore because you don't rock with them like that. Someone who disappeared as far as that child is concerned, or maybe as far as you are concerned, and you don't know how to tell the truth without freaking unraveling right there in front of them. So we're going to talk about that unraveling today. We're going to talk about what it means to be absent in some ways, but still present, right? So maybe dissociated, detached, you're going through the motions and doing the things that need to be done, but you're not really present because all you can be present to in this particular wave of grief is the grief. You know that feeling? I know I do. I know that feeling of being physically there, making sure that everybody good, everybody safe, but emotionally, I'm not quite available, not even to myself, right? So not plugged in that way. And I want to say this with care. That doesn't make you a bad parent. It makes you a grieving person. This is what I've learned to say to myself and remind myself and remind other people that I work with, particularly in a coaching capacity, because people might drop in for a few sessions when they're in the thick of something with their child. And one of the things that I find myself constantly presencing in those spaces and in my own personal parenting grief journey is to remind myself that in those moments when I am emotionally not so available, but logistically available, that does not make me a bad parent. It does not make you a bad parent. It makes you a grieving human. And so in this episode, I'm going to offer you some questions, some framings, and an invitation to grieve more openly, especially if you're in the presence of young people, whether as a parent or in a role where you are nurturing and supporting young people. So, my fellow grief tender, let's start here. Here are 3 questions that I really want you to let work you. All right. How did your parents or caregivers grieve around you? Did they name their grief? Did they even seem like they could name it? I want you to go back with the benefit of hindsight and farm that land, that memory land of how your parents or caregivers grieved around you. This is important because it's helping you to find the foundations of your framing and your relationship with grief. This is not to blame our parents or caregivers. It's not to necessarily involve them now, unless that feels healthy and safe enough that you might reach out to your mom and them and be like, listen, how did you manage grief when you had a loss or a death? And make that difference for them so that we can include in their feeling into this, so that we can include grief that's not just associated with the death of a person. And remember, we call that type of loss or death kananapo. Kananapo is the name we use. There's an entire episode about it in this series, about the name that we use for the grief and loss that is not associated with the death of a person. So if it is good enough, safe enough for you to reach out to that person because they are still around and y'all are cool, or maybe they have died, they have transitioned, but you are in a relationship with them where you can connect and ask, and you have a ritual around that. Do all of that. Do whatever you need to do to work these questions and have them work you. They are important because they're going to speak to your foundations, the initial impressions that you got around what to do with grief. If you cannot remember, if nothing comes up, that's okay. The exercise is not about finding the perfect answer or the right answer for the equation. This is not a formula. It's just feeling through. So even if you can't describe or can't recall how your parents or caregivers grieved around you, whether they named it, whether they could even see it or name it, just you going back is important because it opens up that space for you to go back to early experiences with grief. All right. Maybe you remember a season, if something does come up, maybe you remember a season where somebody you loved got more distant, more angry, more controlling. Maybe they disappeared altogether. Maybe they tried to overcompensate by being fine all the time. I have a friendship that ended pretty horribly. And I can reflect in hindsight on how much that person was like life of the party. Whatever thing we did, whether they came over or were just hanging out or we were road tripping because we were spending a lot of time in Jamaica. And there's nothing like a road trip in Jamaica. But no matter what the scenario, no matter what they were going through, they were just like the life of the party. They were checking in and energizing and laughing, and they were just so upbeat all the time. And come to find out, oh, without getting too much in the business, come to find out that this person was in deep grief around both the death of a person, which was his mother, and then also the death from recent job loss. They had been let go from a company that folded, and a part of them being in Jamaica was really to just like regroup. But it came to pass, like we learned some of the shit that this person was doing because they hadn't tended to that grief. And it was harmful. It was a major blow up. It was a really tight, over a decade tight friend group that blew the fuck up. Like, actually, a divorce happened in that mix, almost physical fighting, whew, literal screaming in the streets. It was heavy. And so much of that in hindsight, I can see and safely say came from that friend not tending to the grief and the loss and overcompensating by being upbeat and fine all the damn time and trying to make sure everybody was too, when in reality, they were consumed by grief that led them to act so much outside of what we had known about this person for over a decade. And they have not been the same since. So what is your version of that as I get myself together to continue recording, because I'm back in the thick of it in some ways, because grief be like that. Like you could be over it, quote unquote, but something can happen and bring you right back into the feelings, like your body is feeling it. Like as I'm talking to you now about this time in our lives, I can feel that my chest has tightened. My right hand moved from sitting on my knee to pressing against my chest. That is one of my symbols that I'm grieving, like how for choking, there's the universal sign of choking where somebody puts their hand around their throat and kind of looks like they're pretending to choke. Well, grief has its tells and signals as well. And that's something else to be aware of in yourself, in your body, and also in your young people. What are your grief tells and maybe what are theirs? And for me, one of them is to open my hand, right? Open my fingers and put it on my chest. I find that I will do that when I am working through grief or grief is working through me. But however it played out, if you had a version of a friend who seemed like they lost their shit when they lost some shit, however it played out, I want to acknowledge that our friends and our caregivers' untended grief taught us something. Whether we realized it or not, it taught us something. And now that you might be the caregiver or the auntie or the sibling or the mentor or the friend, your grief is teaching too. Your grief is teaching too. So here's another question to sit with as I think about grief teaching. How does your untended grief impact the young people in your care? How does your untended grief impact the young people in your care? And equally important, how might your tended grief support them? How might the grief that you have learned from and composted and worked through, how might it support the young people in your care? I freaking love that question. And I'm so glad it came through because it's heavy. And when shit got weight on it, it can often mean that it can super support us through something. So I know that this question can feel heavy. How does your untended grief impact the children in your care? And I know the other question can feel equally heavy. How might your tended grief support them? So take your time with these questions. We're not rushing, because rushing can often bring us towards blame or shame or guilt. This is not about rushing. This is not about blame. It's not about guilt. It's about awareness. It's about grief literacy. It's about the practice. I I'm challenging myself here to share a little bit about maybe something that I've learned while grieving my own shit and trying to stay present for my children's lives. What's coming up are a few things. And again, I keep my children's privacy intact, which is why I don't give you details. But I do try to offer you some of the insights and also some of the struggle, right? So not just shit that I've figured out, but like what I was in the thick of. And so in this case, what comes up is a few things: helping a child through a personal crisis. Like right now, my daughters are 21 and 19. And so they are moving through lots of different types of experiences that I can't change and I might not even have experience with. And so that's one place where I can think about grieving my own shit, as in grieving the loss of a certain type of mother work, where I could be like, oh, come here, sit down, let's talk about it, and likely be able to help them resolve what was going on or offer insights. And while I can still do that now, there are instances where I just have no clue what to do. It ain't even my place. I don't have experience with it. So that's a type of grief that's both about what they're moving through and about my sense of loss of a certain level of supportiveness that I feel I no longer have. Another thing is how my young people, how my children have seen the grief that I navigate with my parents. Both of my parents are alive. Such a blessing, because they are people that are safe, right? They're not tyrannous and violent and toxic. Not to say that that means somebody doesn't deserve life, but in terms of me being in healthy enough relationship with both of them and with my children being in healthy enough relationship with them, that's the blessing that I speak of. And while my parents are alive, there are still, perhaps obviously, there are still points of grief. There are still chips on my freaking shoulder. There are still boundaries that I have intact because of things that I experienced with different versions of my parents. And my children see that. And sometimes I feel ashamed of how I handle something. Sometimes I feel defensive about how I handle something with my parents and how my children see it or how they interpret it. Sometimes I feel bad because one of my daughters is in a position where they saw me in the thick of some grief with one of my parents, or parents-in-law, or parents-in-love, as I like to call them. And they are using their incredible emotional intelligence to help me move through some shit. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't even want you to be dealing with this, or this is not even right, or whatever, whatever baggage that is tacked on to my grief in that moment is also something they have to deal with. And sometimes I don't like that. That makes me feel like they're looking at my inner child or my inner teenager and having to deal with her. And sometimes that feels fine. And other times that makes me feel a lot of things, including shame. So that's something else that I can offer and maybe you can relate to. One more thing that comes up is broke grief. Like, I remember, especially when the girls were younger and we were a digital, nomadic, location independent, unschooling family. So we did not center school. And sometimes that felt like it meant we needed to have the money and the resources to do lots of other learny things, like going to different museums and just other shit that people did, that some homeschooling families did. And it made me feel, there it is again, shame and guilt and frustration and anger about not having the resources to do the things that my children deserved. My partner, Chris, was working his ass off, and I'm out here in these entrepreneurial streets, even though we're both full-time entrepreneurs, but his work has a more tangible component and he can find clients who this is the specific branding or design need that they have. Whereas for me, these are what are considered softer skills or shit that you got to explain to people. And I just was like, oh my God, how come I can't get it together so that I can be a supportive partner and not be extractive in our dynamic because I only be making $2. When the girls were younger, that was such a normal part of my grief work and my family's grief work because my partner Chris dealt with it. My body dealt with it. My mad dashes to do more business like things, even though my way in the world is not really based on that kind of structure. Just so many things. We've talked about grief and jobs and grief and entrepreneurship. And that is also tied to my parenting because so much of my efforts as an entrepreneur had been about generating income so that my family can have good health insurance and that my partner didn't feel like it was all on him and all of these things. And I can say that in those moments, one of the benefits is the development of language for what I was experiencing. So many of us as adults don't know how to talk to young people about grief. And also, if you're listening as a young person, you might also not know how to talk about grief. But right now, in this particular episode, I'm very much zoomed in on parenting because it deserves its own space. And so many of us as adults and as parents, as caregivers, don't know how to talk to kids about grief. We either say too much or we say nothing at all. We try to protect them by hiding our pain, or we offload everything on them with no filter. But in my experience, what young people often need is a bit of honesty, just a bit of honesty, and a lot of courage from us to do it imperfectly. So we can say something like, "Yo, I've been feeling really sad lately, and it's not because of you. It's because I'm missing someone I love. I'm still here with you. I just might be a little slower or a little quieter sometimes." Like we could say something like that at any age. Like this could be talking to a 4 or 5-year-old or a 19-year-old. We can say something like this. "I've been feeling really sad lately. It's because I'm missing someone I love. It's not because of you." And then you might speak to how you're showing up, what they might be noticing. I might be a little quieter. I might go for a walk and not want you to come with me. So I might leave you here with daddy or grandma or mom or whoever. Something like that. Another bit of language might be helping them relate to it in themselves. Like, how sometimes you feel sad and you don't want to play or you don't want to talk? Grown-ups feel like that too. And that's how I'm feeling right now. You might offer the language that allows them or maybe invites them to relate to it. These are grief literate statements. They leave room for the truth without placing the burden of care on the child. That's the point of grief literacy. It's to be honest about what is true and real and to relieve the burden on yourself as someone tending to your grief and also on the people around you because you have developed skills and language to name what is going on. And in the case of parenting in particular, you are not placing that burden of care on the child to figure out what is going on, how to move different, how to make you feel better, and all the shit that they might be doing if we haven't said what is going on. I also often need to remember, as I've said before, that grief and the need for grief tending is not just about someone dying. So back to Kananapo. Sometimes what we are grieving is a non-body death. Sometimes we are grieving the parent we thought we'd be, but haven't been able to become, as we talked about in a previous episode. Sometimes we're grieving the dream that we had for our child that they don't want or don't need. or the version of life that we imagined before this big shift happened in our dynamic as a family. And sometimes, oh my God, sometimes our children are grieving too. That could be an entire episode. Sometimes our children are grieving too, even when we don't know it, even when they don't have the words for it. So building your own grief tending skills can also allow you to recognize and support a young person in acknowledging their grief. So what do we do with all of this? We practice, we slow down, we stay willing to name what's real, even when it's messy or incomplete. We make room for mutual care, because it's not just about your holding your children. It's also about being held by your community, by your practices, by grief literacy itself. I want you to hear that. This is not just about holding your child. It's also about being held, finding other places to tend to your grief, finding ways to name that you are tending to grief, finding ways to recognize when someone else is tending to grief. That's what this entire series is about. It's so that you are not only better able to hold grief, but also better able to be held in your grief and by grief literacy itself. So I'm going to leave you with a few more prompts. I feel foolish in terms of what I wanted to share. So I'm going to leave you with these prompts. I know I've offered you some questions already, but there were some other ones that showed up that I want to make sure I offer in this space. Are you ready? The first one is, what's one thing that your child or a child in your life might be learning from the way you handle grief? That's the first one. Secondly, what kind of grief conversation would you like to have with a young person if you could take the shame out of the room? What do you want to talk about in relation to grief, especially with a young person, but you're feeling some shame around it? Big, big energy question. Oh, and third, what's one way you can tend your own grief more gently this week? Not just for your sake, but for the sake of the children in your care as well. What is one way you can tend to your grief in a more gentle way this week? If this episode stirred something up inside you, come share it with us in the WOW chat room. Hopefully by now you already know what the vibe is there. No performance, no pretending, no big fixing. Just being there, just having a space to be witness and to witness others as we practice this together. So we are nearing the end of the full What I Let Die series, and I'm so grateful that you are still here. Please share the show and be with these questions and prompts. And until next time, be easy with yourself and keep tending to what needs tending. Peace.
This episode is part of a multi-episode series that serves as a public, free grief literacy project called What I Let Die podcast. The show is co-produced by Akila S. Richards and Kate Umstetter-Thompson. Sound editing by Juan Perez. Show art by Chris Richards. Much of the content comes from or is inspired by Akila's Grief Tenders course called the Eyelid Course, an acronym for I Let It Die. Show notes and resources are available at radicalselfie.org/wild. Share the show with friends and be sure to rate the show wherever you listen to it.